Hello and welcome to the explanation phase. In this video we're going to learn the 1 to 6 but mostly 2-player miniature skirmish game Warcry. If you're in the dark on Warcry, what I like about it is its variety, its campaign play, its digestible dose size, and that it's completely free to play. Yep, everything from the core rules to the faction compendiums and the Warband Builders are all completely free. Links below. If that sounds like your cup of tea, join me as we learn how to play. Before we get into the rules proper, let's talk about what we'll need to play. It'll be handy to have a rulebook and a quick reference sheet, links below. Play occurs on a 32 by 22 inch mat. I cut mine out of some thick felt. Honestly, I don't remember. You'll need about 8 pieces of terrain, which you can build or buy or make do with. You'll need a measuring tool, a warband roster, some models fitting for that roster, a battle plan, which we'll discuss in a minute, and loads of tokens. You'll want at least 18 dice, and be helpful if they are in 3 different colors. Speaking of dice, tiny ones are great for damage markers. With that all sorted, here's an overview of how Warcry plays. First, players build their warbands. Then, a scenario is generated. And after that, players deploy their figures, and the first round can begin. At the start of each round, dice are rolled for initiative and ability dice. Then, players alternate activating fighters to move, attack, and use powerful abilities by spending ability dice, all in an attempt to meet the victory conditions of the scenario. You may be competing to run off with the most treasure, hold ground, torch buildings, or simply slay more enemies than your opponent. And that's how a game of Warcry flows. Now we will dive into the rules, starting with warband creation. To make a warband roster, head on over to Warcry and click Warbands. On the left, you'll see the 4 Grand Alliances. If you click this arrow, you'll see the factions in that Grand Alliance. When putting together a roster, note this symbol and this value on your fighter's profile card. This symbol is the faction rune mark, and this number is the fighter's points value. When building your warband, fighters must share a faction rune mark, with some exceptions we will cover in a moment, and the total value of the fighters cannot exceed 1,000 points. Also, you must take at least 3 fighters and no more than 15. The first fighter included in your warband must have your faction rune mark and have the hero rune mark, which looks like this. They may not have the ally rune mark, which is this fist symbol. This first fighter becomes your leader. You may have up to 3 fighters with the hero rune mark in your warband, but only that first one is your leader. You can add fighters from other factions to your roster, but they must fulfill 2 conditions. First, the fighter must be part of the same Grand Alliance as your faction, and second, the fighter must have the ally, thrall, or monster rune mark. Your roster may contain up to 2 allies, 3 thralls, and 1 monster. When your roster is all filled out, it will include fighter profiles, reactions, and abilities, which we'll explain when we get to gameplay. Now let's move on to the setup. To set up, the first thing you do is roll off. The winner decides who's the attacker and who is the defender. Starting with the defender, players divide their forces into 3 battle groups: the dagger, the hammer, and the shield. Fighters must be divided into these groups as evenly as possible, with one exception. Monsters always get their own group. Next, we determine the battle plan. The battle plan is made up of 4 elements: terrain, deployment, victory conditions, and the twist. If you have a battle plan deck, you can separate those cards by their card back and shuffle them up and flip one over from each stack to generate your battle plan. If you don't have that, in the notes below there's a link to a battle plan generator. Either way though, the first step is terrain. If you have official Warcry terrain, then when you flip over the terrain card, it'll show you exactly how to set up that terrain. If you aren't playing with the official Warcry terrain, before flipping over any of the deployment, victory condition, or twist cards, you should first set up any scenery elements as you like, ensuring there are at least 2 terrain features in each quarter of the battlefield, and that the terrain elements are further than 4 inches from any battlefield edge. Then refer to the deployment map and place the red and blue dagger, shield, and hammer tokens on or beside the battlefield, as indicated by the deployment map. These are the deployment points. If terrain was set up according to a terrain map, ensure the orientation of the terrain map matches that of the deployment map. Otherwise, the player who did not set up the terrain chooses the orientation of the deployment map. Then familiarize yourself with the victory conditions and the twist before moving on to deployment. The victory condition describes how victory points are scored, and the twist adds new rules or conditions to the battle. For deployment, players again roll off, and the player with the higher result chooses to deploy from the red or blue deployment points. Next, players alternate setting up battle groups with the attacker going first. The attacker places their dagger, and then the defender does the same. This alternating sequence continues with the shield, and then the hammer. Fighters must be set up wholly within 3 inches from their deployment point. This means no part of their base can be outside of that 3 inches. This distance is measured horizontally, but not vertically. So you can be any distance vertically up, so long as you remain horizontally within 3 inches of your deployment point. When measuring from a deployment point that's on the battlefield, we measure from the very center of that deployment point. When the point appears on the side of the battlefield just touching an edge, we measure from that point. If the deployment map shows a line across a whole board edge or section of a board edge, we can measure anywhere along the denoted area. If you would deploy fighters and they can't all fit within 3 inches of the deployment point, simply place them as close to the deployment point as possible. Some deployment maps include round indicators beside the deployment points. In that case, do not deploy the indicated battle groups during this step. Those battle groups are in reserve and they will join the battle later on during the reserve phase on the corresponding round. I like to place the battle group near the board edge where they'll be coming on. And that's the setup. Over the course of several battle rounds, players will alternate activating their fighters, maneuvering, making attacks, and activating abilities in an attempt to achieve their victory conditions. Each battle round is divided into 3 phases: the initiative phase, the reserve phase, and the combat phase. At the beginning of the initiative phase, both players discard all initiative and ability dice from the previous round. Since this is the first round, we have none. Then, both players roll their 6 initiative dice and arrange their dice into groups by their resulting value. Each die without a matching value is considered a single. A matching set of 2 is a double, a matching set of 3 is a triple, and a matching set of 4 is considered a quad. These matching sets are your ability dice, and will be spent to use your fighter's abilities during the battle. Note that these singles are not ability dice. Now, the player with the most singles has the initiative. If there is a tie, players roll off to determine which player has the initiative. Then each player gains 1 wild die, and beginning with the player holding the initiative, in this case the player with 2 singles, both players declare how they will spend their wild dice. The first thing you could do is hold a wild dice for a later initiative phase. Wild dice saved in this way are not discarded at the beginning of the next initiative phase. So in the next initiative phase, you would gain a new wild die and any that you had saved from previous rounds. Or you can spend it in the following 2 ways. A player can turn any number of wild dice into singles in an attempt to gain or retain the initiative, because at the end of this initiative phase, whoever has more singles will activate the first figure. Or they can spend wild dice to turn singles into ability dice sets or improve an ability dice set by 1 tier. To turn a single into an ability dice set, simply add the wild die to that single, setting it to match the value of the single. This initiative die is no longer a single. It is now part of a double ability dice set. To improve an ability dice set, set the value of the die to match the existing ability dice set. In this way, you can improve a double to a triple, or a triple to a quad. You cannot, however, add more than 1 wild die to a single or ability dice set. So you can only improve a single once, and you can only improve an ability dice set once. Once both players have declared their wild dice, check to see which player has the most singles. That player now has the initiative. If there is a tie, players again roll off to determine the initiative. Next is the reserve phase. Starting on the second battle round, players may have fighters come in from reserve. Check the round indicator on the deployment map. If that number matches the round number, it's time to bring in reserves. Starting with the player holding initiative, players set up their reserves just like they would in the deployment phase. And remember, if you can't fit a fighter wholly within 3 inches of their deployment point because of some obstruction, including enemy models, you place them as close as possible. Then we move on to the action in the combat phase. In the combat phase, players alternate activating 1 fighter at a time. The player with the initiative chooses which player will take the first turn. During your turn, you must activate a fighter with unspent actions. If you have no more fighters with unspent actions, you pass, and the opponent activates fighters until they have no more fighters left with unspent actions. At the beginning of the combat phase, each fighter on the battlefield gets 2 actions to spend that round. During a fighter's activation, they may spend their actions, use up to 1 ability, and take any number of bonus actions they are granted. There are 4 actions fighters can take: move, attack, disengage, and wait. Most fighters will be wanting to get stuck in, so we will cover the move action first. A fighter may take the move action so long as they are not within 1 inch of an enemy fighter. When taking a move action, fighters may move a number of inches equal to their move characteristic, shown on their fighter profile. Measurements are made from the leading edge to the leading edge of the base. During a fighter's move, they cannot move through enemy fighters or through terrain features. And during a move, no part of your fighter's base can go over the battlefield edge. Pre-measuring is allowed and will ensure that no disallowed moves are made. During a move action, a fighter can move in 4 different ways. They can move normally, climb, jump, and some of them can fly. A fighter can move in any or all of these ways in a single move action with no penalty. A fighter is moving normally when the center of their base is on the battlefield or on a platform. While jumping, a fighter may spend some or all of their allotted movement to travel horizontally through the air in a straight line. During this horizontal movement, the fighter may travel downward any number of inches without any cost to their total movement. If the fighter ends their move jumping and is still in the air, it is moved vertically down until the center of its base is on the battlefield floor or a platform. In any case, if the fighter descended 2 or more inches, they suffer impact damage at the end of that move action. We will explain impact damage in a moment. A fighter may also climb. A fighter may begin to climb if they're touching an obstacle. While climbing, the fighter can move up and down the obstacle while remaining within half an inch of it. The fighter is climbing until the center of its base is on a platform or the battlefield floor. A fighter can finish a move action climbing if they want, but if that fighter is still climbing at the end of their activation, they will fall. Fighters with a mounted rune mark cannot climb, with the exception of climbing stairs, which we'll talk about later. When a fighter falls, the opposing player picks a point within 2 inches horizontally that is lower down on a battlefield floor or a platform. The fighter is placed with the center of their base on that point. However, if there's no point within 2 inches that can be found that will accommodate the falling fighter, because the space is occupied by other fighters or because of terrain, the falling fighter is taken down instead. If the falling fighter can be placed within 2 inches and is now 2 inches or more vertically lower than where they started, they take impact damage. When a fighter takes impact damage, roll a die. On a 1, the fighter takes 3 damage. On a 2 or 3, the fighter takes 1 damage. And on any other result, they take no damage. Fighters with the fly rune mark can fly during a move action. While flying, figures measure distance horizontally normally and may move up or down without restriction during their movement. However, a flyer cannot end their movement flying. Recall that if a fighter is within 1 inch of an enemy fighter, they cannot take the move action. They can, however, take the disengage action. When a fighter takes the disengage action, they move up to 3 inches and must end more than 1 inch away from any enemy fighter. If the disengaging fighter cannot end up at least 1 inch away from all enemy fighters, they cannot take the disengage action. During this disengage move, the fighter cannot jump, climb, or fly, and this disengage move does not count as a move action. The attack action is informed by 6 of the 8 numbers on your character's fighter profile. So now would be a good time to familiarize ourselves with all those characteristics and the flow of an attack action. This is a fighter profile. It has 20 wounds, 4 toughness, 4 movement, costs 150 points. This is its faction rune mark, and other rune marks. These are its weapons. This is the range of the weapon, the attacks, the strength, and the damage. This first number is the damage for hits, and the second number is the damage for crits. This box contains the characteristics for a weapon. Some fighters have multiple weapons, while others just the one. When making attacks, range is how many inches away the target can be from the attacker. Attacks determine the number of dice rolled for the attack. Then, with reference to this chart, the strength of the attack is compared to the target's toughness. If the strength is greater than the toughness, then 3s, 4s, and 5s are hits. If the strength and toughness are the same, 4s and 5s are hits. If the strength is lower than the target's toughness, only 5s are hits. Then damage is dealt for each hit and crit. Every roll of a 6 is a crit. For instance, if this Chaos Warrior was attacking this orc, the first thing we would do was ensure that the target was in range. Then we would roll the number of dice listed here, then compare the strength of the weapon to the toughness of the target. In this case, they're the same, so 4s and 5s are hits. With this roll, there would only be 1 hit, and we would deal 3 damage. Let's imagine one of these was a crit. In that case, we would have 1 hit and 1 crit. We would total that damage and deal 8 damage. If the amount of damage a fighter has taken ever reaches up to their wound characteristic, shown here, that fighter is taken out. Remove that fighter from the battlefield, they can no longer be activated, use abilities, or take actions. And that's the overview of the attack action. Now we'll get into the weeds. To take an attack action, first choose a weapon on your fighter. Then choose a visible enemy fighter within range of the weapon as the target. A fighter is visible to another fighter if you can draw a line from any part of one fighter to any part of the other fighter, without counting their base as part of the fighter. In this case, the Chaos Warrior behind the pillar is not visible to the Orc, because the Orc can only draw a line to part of its base. But if the Chaos Warrior was just slightly around the corner and you could see his toe, then the Chaos Warrior would be visible to the Orc and be a valid attack target. Also, note for rules purposes, fighters are never visible to themselves. In addition to range and visibility, there are some additional limitations to targeting that we'll go over now. If there are any enemy fighters within 1 inch of the attacking fighter, one of them must be selected as the target of your attack. So in this case, despite being armed with a bow, this Orc could not target this Chaos Warrior, because this one is within 1 inch. For fear of harming an ally, a fighter cannot target an enemy fighter who is within 1 inch of another friendly fighter with a missile attack action. There is, however, one exception to this that we'll cover in a moment. But first, what makes an attack a missile attack? Any weapon with a range or maximum range greater than 3 inches makes missile attacks. If a weapon has 2 range values, the first is the minimum range and the second is the maximum range. A weapon with a minimum range cannot target a fighter within its minimum range, but can target fighters up to its maximum range. For instance, this Orc's bow has a minimum range of 3 and a maximum range of 15 inches. So, it can easily target this Chaos Warrior. But if this Chaos Warrior was within 3 inches, the Orc would not be able to use its bow to target that warrior. The one exception to this limitation is you can target the enemy fighter if the missile attack has no minimum range, and the attacker is within 3 inches of the target. When making an attack, if the nearest point between the two fighters passes through an obstacle, and the attacker is more than 1 inch from the terrain element, the defender has cover. Or, if the defending fighter is on a platform that's 2 inches higher than the attacking fighter, it also gains cover. A fighter with cover treats its toughness value as 1 higher for the resolution of that attack. Sometimes doing nothing is the best option. Fighters can take the wait action. When a fighter takes the wait action, its activation ends. The fighter has 2 actions, so if you spend 1 to take the wait action, that leaves the fighter with 1 unspent action. You can mark that with this spent action token. Now, since this fighter has actions remaining, it can be activated again this round and take that action. Or it could use that action to take a reaction. Also, remember, fighters can use 1 ability each time they are activated. So a wait action could allow a normal fighter to use up to 2 abilities in 1 battle round, because they'll be activated twice. Speaking of, what are reactions and abilities? Remember those ability dice we set aside earlier? It's time to talk about how they are used in a battle. Each faction has its own set of abilities, and fighters within those factions may use the abilities if their profile has the matching rune mark. When you make a Warband roster online, all your fighters' abilities will come with it on these pages. In addition to abilities tied to specific factions and rune marks, there is a list of universal abilities available to all factions, shown here. To use an ability during a fighter's activation, select an ability with no rune marks, or a rune mark matching the active fighter. Then discard the ability dice set that meets or exceeds the tier required for that ability. For instance, this rune mark matches the rune mark for the charge ability, so this Orc can use a double to charge. Then you simply apply the ability and continue with the fighter's activation. Remember, bonus actions are free and don't use up a fighter's limited number of actions. During their activation, a fighter can use an ability at any time except in the middle of resolving an action. They can even use an ability after taking their final action for that activation. Next, we'll talk about reactions. If you take a look at your ability sheet, you'll see at the top there are reactions. And on the universal ability sheet, you'll also see universal reactions. Now, reactions are not abilities. They are special actions you can take out of turn when some specific conditions are met. There are 3 universal reactions available to all fighters, and each faction has its own unique reaction. When the conditions for a reaction are met, a fighter can use a reaction if they have at least 1 unspent action. After applying the reaction, the fighter is considered to have expended an action, and you can make that clear with the spent action token. If they make an additional reaction after they've already made one, you can replace that spent action token with the completed activation token, which will denote that this fighter has no more actions. Next, we'll talk about terrain. Terrain types in Warcry are a good hobby opportunity whether you are painting an official set or making your own. They add tactile depth to the game by creating spaces accessible to some fighters and inhibiting others, and by providing opportunities to take cover from enemy attacks. When you set up terrain in Warcry, declare what types of terrain each element will be. And remember, terrain can be multiple types at once. The terrain types are obstacle, low terrain, platforms, deadly terrain, unscalable terrain, stairs, ladders, archways, and doors. Low terrain is less than 1 inch tall and doesn't require any vertical movement to pass through. Fighters can simply move normally over it. Obstacles are 1 inch tall or taller and prevent horizontal movement through them. They can be climbed over, or jumped over, or flown over. Platforms are horizontally flat areas that are larger than 1 inch by 1 inch. You can move normally on a platform. Stairs and ladders are like obstacles, with the exception that mounted fighters can climb stairs. And fighters climbing stairs and ladders at the end of their activation don't fall. Instead, they stay partway up. If the model can't fit where it is, mark their place with something. I like using a die turned to the number of inches they have climbed. Unscalable terrain is treated like an obstacle, except it cannot be climbed on, and if a fighter somehow ends their turn on it, they take impact damage and fall. The final two types of terrain are doors and archways. Fighters can move through these portals, even if their base doesn't fit, so long as they have enough movement to get all the way through the portal, and their base fits on the other side. But some fighters are a bit too burly to fit through these cramped spaces. Monsters and mounted fighters cannot move through archways or doors. Additionally, beasts lack the dexterity to open doors and cannot pass through them. And finally, fighters may duck under high terrain while moving normally. So long as the distance between the floor and the overhang isn't greater than half the height of the fighter, they can pass under the feature if they can get all the way through it and fit on the other side. Victory conditions often revolve around controlling objectives or carrying treasure tokens. To gain control of an objective, a player must have more fighters within 3 inches of the objective than there are enemy fighters within 3 inches of the objective. Usually this is checked at the end of the round. Once a player gains control of an objective, they keep it until another player takes control of it, whether they leave any fighters next to it or not. Battles are often fought over treasure. A fighter can pick up a treasure token if during the move action they pass within 1 inch of it. When they pick it up, remove it from the battlefield. The fighter is now carrying it. Not all fighters can pick up treasure though. A fighter who's already carrying treasure cannot pick up another one. Monsters and beasts are also not interested or lack the dexterity to pick up treasure. Additionally, treasures are heavy and reduce a fighter's ability to maneuver on the battlefield. While holding a treasure, a fighter's move characteristic is reduced by 2 down to a minimum of 3. If a fighter is taken out while holding a treasure, it is dropped. The treasure is placed 1 inch horizontally by the player who controlled the treasure. A fighter can also drop a treasure voluntarily by spending an action. It is also placed within 1 inch horizontally of that figure. Finally, all measurements to and from objective and treasure tokens are made to the center of the token, which is helpful if you want to use homemade tokens, because the diameter of the token isn't important for gameplay. So for instance, a measurement from a fighter to an objective would be from the nearest edge of the fighter's base to the center of the objective token. But the measurement between two objective tokens would be from the centers of both tokens. Next we will talk about a special kind of fighter called monsters. Monsters have been the exception to several rules already, and now we will go over several more. Fighters have 2 actions each battle round, but monsters have 3. Generally, fighters take all their actions during their activation, unless they use the wait action, but monsters can only take 1 action per activation. So monsters will usually activate 3 times in a round, and monsters cannot take any reactions. You can mark actions a monster has spent with these spent action tokens. Monsters can use an ability once each time they are activated. Monsters cannot use universal abilities. Instead, there are a set of universal monster abilities that these monster fighters gain access to. And each monster has its own unique ability as well. Now, if that wasn't enough, monsters also grant enemy fighters special abilities too. If a monster is in play, all fighters, except beasts and monsters, can use the abilities on the Monster Hunting Abilities chart. No additional rune marks are required to use these abilities. Unlike other fighters, monsters get weaker as they take damage. Each monster has a chart that details how its characteristics change as it takes damage. These are found in the entry for that monster, either online or in its PDF. It is easy to forget this chart because it's not on the roster printout. I like to use a sticky note as a reminder. As mentioned previously, monsters also make up their own battle group during deployment. And when monsters are set up during deployment or during the reserve phase, they do not need to be wholly within 3 inches of the deployment point, only within 3 inches. This accommodates their large base and allows them to be deployed further forward because they only have to have a tiny portion of their base within 3 inches of the deployment point. There are additional rules for match play and narrative campaign play, and those rules are linked in the notes below. But otherwise, that's everything you need to know to get started playing Warcry. If you have any questions about anything we went over here, leave them in the comments below and I'd be happy to respond to them as time allows. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon to be notified when we release more how to plays. And if you want to support me in my mission to make minis games more accessible, you can become a supporter over on Ko-Fi. Either way, until next time, thanks for watching.